Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Canadian Council for the Americas webinar on Trump's economic and other war or attacks on Canada. I'm going to switch to Spanish for a second so that I can explain to the Spanish speakers that this will be interpreted simultaneously into Spanish. Buenas noches a todos y gracias por estar con nosotros. Hoy, ya sabemos que el tema que vamos a discutir hoy es una cosa muy pertinente y tiene ramificaciones para el resto del mundo y sobre todo América Latina también. Este webinar vamos a hacer en inglés, pero tenemos interpretación simultánea al español. Si quieren escuchar la interpretación en español, puedes apretar el botón abajo. Y pueden escuchar eso, el intérprete, el gran intérprete Jairo Botero de Medellín, Colombia. Ahora voy a cambiar al inglés de nuevo y gracias de nuevo por estar con nosotros. Thank you again, everybody, for being with us. I was just explaining to our Spanish listeners that interpretation is available just by pushing the button below. The interpreter is Jairo Botero, our great interpreter, works with us often from Medellín, Colombia. This seminar responds to overwhelming demand that we've had and request for information or explanation of what's going on the theme of the topic tonight and numerous media interviews that both Marta and I have been doing in Latin American media. And so we thought one way of getting out the message, as it were, or the conversation, was to do our own webinar. Certainly, this will not be the last on this topic because this topic is not going away, at least as far as anybody can foresee. But that is why we're presenting it tonight, and thank you for attending on such short notice. This discussion will be, as I say, in English. It will be on the record. We will try to entertain your questions. We know there will be many of them, and we will try and integrate them into the conversation. There is a lot to cover tonight in a short amount of time, but we will do our best to do that. I think at this point, I turn it over to Marta Blackwell to introduce our panelists and start us off in the conversation.
Thanks so much, Ken. Hi, everybody, and thanks for being with us tonight. I get the pleasure of introducing our esteemed panelist. On my screen, we have Alex Panetta. He's the correspondent for CBC based in Washington, D.C. We've got Eric Miller. He's the president of the Rideau Potomac Strategy Group, and he's based in DC and Ottawa often. And then we've got Doug Saunders, who's our columnist and focused on international affairs at the Globe and Mail. So to start us off, actually, I'm going to turn over to Alex and ask him to give us a bit of an overview and a sort of grounding place from where to jump off. Like, where are we? What is this about? What's actually occurred? So Alex, over to you.
Sure. Gracias a todos por su participación, and I will apologize for that. That is about the extent of the Spanish I will attempt this evening. I will not torture you with it any further, but I will attempt to give you a brief overview of how we got to where we are today. So I think most people are aware that Donald Trump, throughout the 2024 election, promised global minimum tariffs on every country around the world. Sometimes it was usually 10% that he was threatening, and sometimes it was 20, and sometimes it was 100, and he bounced around on the details. And it was always clear that it was never going to be precisely that one global number. But he certainly set the context for his tariff policy. And since the election, we've learned from his Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, during his confirmation hearing that Trump sees, or this administration will see, tariffs as fulfilling three objectives: raising tax revenue, national security, right, to reshore certain critical supply chains, and as negotiating leverage with other countries. And I believe what is going on with Canada and Mexico fits into all three of those buckets. So why Canada? Why Mexico? Why were these the first targets? So in the weeks after the election, President-elect Trump at this point says, I'm going to be imposing tariffs on Inauguration Day of 25% on Canada and Mexico for the instability at the border, migration and fentanyl. So I believe the reason he did that, and he began with his own neighborhood and on this one specific issue, is because it was the easiest thing he could do fastest. All right. If you look at the 1977 International Emergency Economic Powers Act, it allows the president of the United States to impose tariffs on a foreign country if he invokes a national emergency, which is what he did with the border. Now, the Emergency Economic Powers Act has never been used in this way. And I think a lot of people were surprised that he would have used it on Canada and Mexico under these circumstances. Certainly the stock market did not expect it to be used on Canada and Mexico this way because the market never really reacted to the threat, and it's begun reacting in the last few days. So he makes this threat. Justin Trudeau flies down to Mar-a-Lago. The Mexican government takes a more, wait and see approach. Trudeau flies down to Mar-a-Lago. The Canadian government, I can speak about what Canada did, but just uncorks this series of promises about things it's willing to do. Spending a little over $1 billion in border security measures, putting helicopters on the border. But beyond that, I think it's substantively engaged the United States on the fentanyl issue. I think some people have noticed that less than 1% or about 1% of fentanyl stopped close to the U.S. land borders is on the Canadian side. 99% is on the Mexican side, as if to say this is all a pretext. Now, I think I engaged this issue at face value late last year because there are signs of, trouble in the fentanyl trade on the Canadian side. Anecdotal evidence of growing fentanyl, the growing presence of fentanyl labs, a failure of Canadian law enforcement to punish money laundering. You see Toronto Dominion Bank has just gotten a massive fine in the United States for money laundering. Wasn't happening in Canada. So anyway, Canada looks at these issues substantively and says, we're going to impose a whole suite of new money laundering rules and border security measures. And I believe that most people here believe that Canada had been acting in good faith. As a matter of fact, Trump's transition team put out a celebratory announcement saying, Trump got results, but Canada still got the tariffs, right? And so it's become clear over the last few weeks that he saw these tariffs as more than negotiating leverage, and he also saw them as more than a fentanyl issue. And case in point, in the last couple of weeks, what I've heard is that the members of the administration meeting with car companies have said, if you want to be excused from these quote unquote fentanyl tariffs, wink wink, if you want a long-term permanent exemption, just agree to reduce your production footprint in Canada by up to 50%, and Mexico as well, to a lesser extent. But basically, they basically telling car companies they can get this exemption from fentanyl tariffs if they steer their production lines back to the United States. The car companies, from what I understand, would not commit to that. So you're getting this weird melange of tariffs now. Some of them are imposed. He's kind of backtracked on a chunk of them, but he's proceeding forward, to misquote Otis Redding. I think, you're sitting on the dock of the bay watching the tide, the tariffs roll in and watch them roll back out again, but you're constantly getting wet, and the tariffs are coming again this week, steel and aluminum tariffs. And you're getting more tariffs as of, at some point after April 1st, as the administration elaborates its full suite of tariff policies. And the stock market has begun to react. The economy has begun to react. And if look no further than searches on Google Trends to see that the American people have begun to notice. There's, searches for tariffs during the election campaign were barely a ripple. And over the last few days, it has just surged. And what this tells me is that Kamala Harris's attempts to make American voters notice and care about this issue might have failed in 2024, but Americans and the stock market are starting to notice in 2025. So that's where we are today.
Thanks, Alex. Do you want to just talk a little bit of the pretext on the illegal border crossings?
Yeah. I mean, so my understanding, there were, obviously we've seen the migration situation in the last few years in the United States. This is part of the, national emergency President Trump has invoked. You've also seen him celebrate the plummet the plummeting in illegal border crossing. So on the one hand, celebrating the success of his policies, yet still maintaining the national emergency. That's the justification for his tariffs. And there had been crossing, to a much lesser extent than in Mexico on the Canadian side. But yeah, you're seeing illegal border crossing diminish drastically on both the northern and southern border, but the tariffs are still there.
Thanks, Alex. If we can move over a little bit from that and start sort of talking about what the impact of this is and the economic and trade impact. So, Eric, if I can pull you in, sort
Sure.
of the initial imposition of the tariff, sort of like what's the broader economic and trade impact of the policies, and if you can start bringing in sort of supply chain issues and other factors in that. Thanks.
Sure. The impact of the tariffs are absolutely enormous. So Canada and the United States and Mexico and the United States and the three countries together are deeply interconnected. They've spent the last 30 to 40 years building up a system of co-production where manufacturing takes place in various levels in each of the three countries. You have parts moving across the border 5, 6, 7, 8 times as they are built into finished products. You also have a lot of unusual points of integration. And so if you think about a steak that you may be sitting down to eat at your dinner table tonight, well, that cow may have been born in Alberta, and it may have been raised in Nebraska, and it may have been slaughtered in Alberta and then sold for distribution across the United States. You have similar actions on the southern border with Mexico. And so you have this massive amount of economic integration, which people don't think about. But now what's happening with the economy is it's beginning to feel the effects. So whether it's projects that are not sure where they're going to get steel from, because nobody in the US makes the specialty steel that they need, and they're not sure what the tariffs are going to be when they import it, whether it's an investment in a new production line, which is not happening because people don't know what the tariff rates are. Everywhere you go, you hear people saying, how can we deal with this? What is the situation? How do we find ways to get around it? There are options in terms of tariff engineering, but they are very complex. And given the fact that the tariff policy is changing by the day, then this is something which is difficult to plan for at this moment in time. And so tariffs are starting to weigh very, very heavily on the US economy. President Trump came out in the last day or so and said he is not ruling out the prospect of a recession. You're seeing companies that do not know what they're going to look at in terms of their cost structures. I mean, every day I get notes from people saying, I shipped my goods last Tuesday when the tariffs were in effect, and my $40,000 shipment, it became a $50,000 shipment because I had to pay the 25% tariff. And so it's extraordinarily disruptive. And I think it's a big indication of what one is to look at. And just to finish off, you have the reciprocal tariffs, which President Trump has called the big one, which are scheduled to come into effect on April 2nd. And if you look at them, the way that they're cast are, we'll charge you what you charge us, except their definition of tariffs include things like value-added taxes or goods and services taxes. They include any kind of domestic tax, whether it's a carbon tax or some other measure, which the US doesn't like. They include currency manipulation as interpreted by the US Treasury, a whole series of other non-tariff measures. And of course, my favorite of all, the declaration that the retaliatory tariff will include anything, quote, written or unwritten that is perceived by the United States. And so if you start thinking about the fact that the average country, Canada has about a 5 to 15% goods and services tax. The countries in Europe tend to have an average of 20% value-added tax. Value-added taxes are in 174 countries. And so once you start adding up all of those different pieces, countries around the world could easily be looking at 50, 60, 70% tariffs before you even count the other tariffs, which we've seen so far, which, by the way, are stackable. So if you get a 25% tariff on steel or aluminum, that gets added on to, let's say, hypothetically, your 50% reciprocal tariff. And if there are special tariffs on softwood lumber, which have been threatened from Canada, those get added on. So we are looking at a situation where it is not outside the realm of possibility, where countries in Latin America could be looking at well into double digit and perhaps in some cases even triple digit tariffs, which will have a profound effect not only on their world trade, but will effectively push the United States a long way down the road of exiting something that looks like the global economy.
Eric, thank you very much. Alex, well, I'll go quick, Alex, because I want to bring Doug into the conversation.
Yeah, I just want to make a quick personal anecdote to illustrate something that Eric said about this messing up supply chains. This weekend, I was doing some repairs at home, and the contractor apologized to me, saying, like, I may have to, like, depending on what wood I source, this lumber from Canada has got this tariff on it now, apologizing to me. And I revealed that I was Canadian, and he sort of said, I'm sorry for that too, because he's really just mistreating you guys lately. Anyway, the reason I mention it is to illustrate that this has now penetrated the public consciousness in a way that it had not until the stock market tanked over the last week. And now, you've got contractors complaining about it. It just comes up in conversation spontaneously in a way it did not until just the last few days.
Thanks, Alex. And Doug, thank you for being so patient. Comments on anything that you've heard, and also if you could address how Canada has responded to this so far at a federal level and at a provincial level.
Yes.
That and anything else you want to bring in.
Let me just start by providing a bit of wider context for those of you who are elsewhere in the Americas on the unique position that Canada's in this regard. I think some aspects of it would be familiar to Mexicans, but Canada is unique among, you could say, highly developed nations in its dependency on the United States and on its inability to move away from that dependency on the United States. About 2/3 of Canada's economy is trade, and close to 80% of that trade, depending how you measure it, 75 to 80%, is with the United States. And much of that trade, as Eric noted, is in sectors that are kind of geographically rooted. Petroleum exports that require pipelines that could not easily, except at a marginal level, be moved anywhere else. Softwood lumber used in construction, we could diversify a bit to Mexico for that, but not to a large degree because of it's heavy. And integrated supply chains for automobiles. I mean, when I was a teenager, I worked on the assembly line of the Ford pickup truck factory in Oakville. And what we would typically do, and what is still typically done there, is we would take gears that were manufactured in Ontario, and we would put them in a differential casing that had been brought up from Michigan and imported into Canada. Then we would export that whole differential to the United States, where it would be put in a drivetrain that would be imported again into Canada and put into a pickup truck that would then be exported south of the border and sold in the United States. Under Donald Trump's tariffs, that would be tariffed at 25% 5 times. Of course, these auto industry tariff rulings change all the time. And that's been how automobiles have been made in North America since 1965. And a lot of other industries have those back and forth across the border supply chains. We cannot easily diversify it. There was an estimate by Bloomberg, a study in November that looked at the impact of 20% tariffs from the United States on various countries and regions. It found that the countries of the European Union, after a couple of years, would actually see a slight increase in trade revenues by replacing US markets with their own consumer markets, at least for goods. It found that the countries of Asia, like Vietnam, would also similarly be able to replace it. But it found that after 2 years, Canada would lose 20% of its trade income permanently. It couldn't be replaced that way. I should also stress just how unrooted in any motive this is. Alex hinted at this, that Donald Trump appeared to list a bunch of reasons for doing this. Canada has no fentanyl exports, notable. It was claimed by the Trump administration that of the 4,000 and something pounds of fentanyl that are imported into the United States from abroad, that 24 pounds of it came from Canada. But my colleagues did an investigation where they looked at border seizures, and that number is probably closer to 0. DEA people say it makes no economic sense for drug organizations to make fentanyl in Canada for export. There's certainly plenty in Canada that creates problems domestically. Likewise, the irregular border crosser migrant numbers from Canada to the United States are negligible. And there are a lot of indications from what Donald Trump says, both to the prime ministers of Canada on the phone and even in his speeches, that what he wants is a reconstruction of the era of President McKinley, when that was before income taxes were invented during the First World War, and the United States funded its government using duties and tariffs and things like that. And that he imagines, and he speaks about this in his speeches, returning to a time when tariffs are the main source of government revenue, and also a wider McKinleyan agenda. That was the era when the United States seized, Cuba, Philippines, etc., in territorial actions. And we can talk about that when we talk about the political aspects of this as well. Does that mean there's a specific program or agenda to do these things? No. But it means that that is the sort of fantasy language that he talks about. He does threaten Canada's sovereignty on an almost daily basis in his language. So Canada's response has been extraordinary. And I think some of you in your other countries have experienced this perhaps as well, but perhaps more in Canada than anywhere else, because we've never had this kind of threat from the United States. We've never had the kind of threat that people in Latin America experienced 130 years ago, and that sort of thing. There's been a real coming together of political parties. We've seen both Prime Minister Trudeau, who's now ex-Prime Minister Trudeau, we'll maybe get to that, talk about imposing countervailing tariffs. But most significant probably is a group of premiers of the Canadian provinces who who are generally a conservative bunch. Some of them had been quite pro-Trump in previous incarnations, imposing a set of unilateral actions to punish the United States, essentially. The province of Ontario, home to about 40% of Canadian people, has imposed a 25% surcharge on all electricity exported to the United States from the big generating plants in Niagara Falls and the nuclear reactors in Pickering and all that sort of thing. They have removed all U.S. liquor, beer and wine from the shelves of the provincial monopoly liquor store, which is one of the largest alcohol buyers in the world. Now, just to give you a sense of how little leverage Canada has for countervailing actions that are effective, we heard the president of the company that makes Jack Daniels on an earnings call complaining about this because he suddenly lost the entire Canadian market. It was definitely a more effective measure than a countervailing tariff on alcohol would have been, because losing 25%, a lot of Canadians would pay 25% more to buy Jack Daniels, losing the entire market. But he pointed out all of Canada accounts for 1% of that company's market. And that's pretty typical of the situation. Now, a company losing 1% of its market, of its revenue all at once, you feel that, but it's not going to bankrupt you. So that indicates how limited Canada's countervailing actions are in terms of being felt by the US public, in terms of having a and market and political effect on the United States. For us, a 25% tariff is devastating to the economy, and we can cite all sorts of figures about what it would almost certainly create at least 2 quarters of sharp economic downturn. So it would put us into recession and possibly depression. It would sink productivity. It would drive up unemployment. It would create a economic and fiscal emergency on a scale, and this is happening right now. So, so we are sort of in a unique position. There's talk, and we'll talk about this later, about building alliances with other countries that are affected by the United States, but Canada is not going to rescue itself by diversifying elsewhere. We're going to have to tough this out.
Thank you, Doug. And Doug, you gave us a perfect segue into talking about the attacks on Canadian sovereignty. So we want to get to that in a minute. I just wanted to ask Eric and Alex if they wanted to add anything more to this economic attack section that we're on now.
Just one observation about a historical parallel, and you know, Eric, I think it was Eric was talking about, or maybe Doug, about the integration of our auto sector since 1965. It's interesting. Within a few years, the Americans had started to express regret about the extent to which auto production had shifted north. And that was, you know, not a major factor, but one of the reasons that Richard Nixon attempted to address the balance of trade with a 10% global tariff in 1971. And it's funny, I was looking at it through the New York Times archives from 1971, and they describe how this unleashed a wave of nationalism in Canada, with people stitching maple leaves on their backpack to sort of like, not unlike what we're seeing right now. I think, although we're probably seeing it on a much more accentuated scale now, but it had that effect back then. And what it led to was this a decade-long push to diversify our trade, to be less economically dependent on the United States. It led to some disastrous policy, and some, you know, some could argue that the national energy program, the partial nationalization of our energy sector, was part of the fallout from that sort of era. But guess what we didn't do was diversify our trade from the United States. That Pierre Trudeau tried, Justin Trudeau and his successors may try, but you know, we're butting up against geography and the laws of nature. So
thanks,
Yeah,
Alex. Eric, go ahead.
Yeah, what I would say is that, well, Canada does not have as much leverage as it wished it had to deal with the threats from Donald Trump. And keep in mind, even going back to the renegotiation of NAFTA in 2018-19, Trump threatened the, quote, ruination of the Canadian economy. And so this is not something that has just recently begun. But integration cuts both ways. And part of why the auto tariffs got removed, or temporarily initially, was because the auto companies were looking at a world where half the models that they made would no longer be economic. And so if you make an A, B, or C series vehicles, one of those small to mid-sized vehicles, I mean, you can make as little as $800 or $1,000 profit on those vehicles. And by the time you start to add tariffs on top of that, those vehicles are no longer economic. So the automakers went to the White House and said, you put tariffs on, large percentages of assembly facilities for automobiles in North America will close quickly. Large percentages of supplier facilities in North America will close quickly. And so what this means is Donald Trump looked at the prospect of 10 or 20,000 jobs in Michigan disappearing within a week of the tariffs going into effect. And that is something that Canada has in its favor. Similarly, it was mentioned about electricity. Canada supplies large quantums of electricity. About 6 million homes are powered with electricity from Canada. And Premier Doug Ford put a 25% surcharge on the exports of electricity. He has also threatened that if the tariffs are not removed, that Canada will cut off flows of electricity, which would put 1.5 million Americans in 3 states in the dark. And so there is the potential for this kind of punitive destruction that will play itself out. And well, Canada is not in any way, shape, or form as strong to take on the U.S. in a direct fight. The realities of integration, coupled with areas of Canadian leverage, could work in Canada's favor to at least get the attention of American policymakers and American citizens that this trade fight with Canada is not worthwhile and should be reversed.
Thanks, Eric. Okay, let's do that segue. I think it ties in nicely with one of the questions that we had from our attendees, and thank you again for submitting the questions, which is, there's one thing to say that Trump is doing this for pure economic reasons because his theories, this is the way it works. You know, if I win, you have to lose for me to win, and we want to bring all the manufacturing back into the US, et cetera, whatever theory you might want to come up to. But there's, you know, the question is, what really might else be behind this? And that brings us right to the segue of the attacks on Canadian sovereignty, talking about redrawing the boundaries and recent conversations that was really recently reported out, I think, by the New York Times. Maybe I'll go to you first, Alex. Do you want to talk about the attacks on, other than the economic attacks on Canada, the sovereignty, even the concept of military intervention that all of a sudden now is being floated about?
Sure. So, you know, the president was asked whether he would invade Canada or attack Canada militarily. This is before the election. Before his inauguration. And he said, no, he would use economic means to make Canada the 51st state. And he's continued referring to Canadian annexation in speeches, including before the World Economic Forum. So the fact that he started to mention this in international gatherings has made a lot of people nervous, especially in Canada. But I have to say, this story, this one aspect of this story is the bane of my existence as a Canadian correspondent in Washington, because there is such a disconnect in the conversation. Canadians are unnerved. It's a topic of daily conversation there. Whereas here, very few people take it seriously. Most people assume he's bluffing or using it as negotiating leverage, or just simply aren't listening. And that's you know, they look at you like you're crazy if you ask about Trump annexing Canada. They say, well, it's just one person talking about it. That one person happens to be the president of the United States and commander-in-chief of the military. But Americans don't believe it. I mean, if you look at, there's a really interesting YouGov survey a couple of weeks ago that looked at public opinion in Canada and in the United States. And just two takeaways from that survey. One, Americans asked, why do you think Trump is doing this? I think 18% said that they saw this as potentially a flex to try to get Canada to join the United States. So very few people are taking his words at face value here or listening. And I think it was like 13% of Republicans, perhaps. So on the other side, in Canada, I don't think they asked this very same question, but they asked people in both countries how they viewed the neighbor. And Americans still overwhelmingly view Canadians as friends. I think something like 82 to 88%, when asked whether Canada is a friend, an ally, an adversary, an enemy, use positive language. Only 6% called Canada an adversary or an enemy. Whereas in Canada, it's staggering. Like half of Canadian respondents, like 50%, said they view the United States as an enemy or adversary. And that, to me, is just, I mean, there's just this massive disconnect in this conversation where Canadians are livid. They are highly engaged in this debate. Americans hadn't been paying much attention to it. They have the last couple of days. Someone mentioned Jack Daniels and bourbon. I'm seeing Jack Daniels on TV now. CNN's talking about this, repeatedly. The trade war, like I said, Google searches have gone up. It's gone from like being completely off the radar to on it right now in the United States. But again, the Canadian sovereignty element, it's still not quite there yet. The New York Times, as you said, referred to it in some reporting. Most of the details in that story had been previously reported, but some elements of it were new, including some threats that Trump and his people drop in conversation with Canadians about whether we belong in certain international organizations or whether the border should be withdrawn. Anyway, Americans don't take it seriously, and Canadians do.
Thanks, Alex. Doug, if I could ask you to jump in on this particular question and actually bring in a little bit of the defense conversation, because there's also, I mean, there has been some, and not erroneously, Canadian participation in NATO and also paying for its own defense. That's been part of the reasons why some of this is being put on Canada. If you could bring that into this conversation and sort of what that's happening, what's happening with that, both in Canada and then the reasons for it from the US.
Yeah. I mean, Canadians, along with a lot of other non-US countries, we're already having a conversation about defense in the context of Trump after he made it very clear that he's no longer supporting Ukraine, and appears to be backing Vladimir Putin in that struggle, which implies a very large increase in support. Canada is always going to be fairly stalwart in that because we have more than I think close to 3 million Canadians of Ukrainian ethnicity. Suddenly, I mean, overnight in the last 3 days or so, that conversation has shifted one to bolstering our defense against a hypothetical incursion or attack or annexation by the United States. And I think Alex is correct in noting that Americans have no idea how serious the conversation in Canada is about this. In the last few days, we've seen respected Canadian commentators broaching the idea of developing a Canadian nuclear arsenal as an idea. It's hopefully not a serious idea, but it's reached that level of discourse. We had a famous Canadian insurgency and guerrilla warfare scholar write a paper that got widely circulated last week, explaining how a Canadian guerrilla urban war against a U.S. occupation would play out, and these things. And this is partly because this is very new to Canadians. Certainly, anti-American sentiments have always been part of the Canadian political discourse. I've often argued that instead of having a left-right political spectrum, Canada has degrees of pro and anti-Americanism. But those figures that Alex cited showing that 80% of Canadians or something like that see the United States as an enemy, those are not timeless figures. This is not the sort of figures you'd see in Latin America and parts of the Caribbean, where, because of the history, a certain amount of anti-Americanism is always part of the popular view. In Canada, generally speaking, anti-Americanism is a niche belief. It certainly when there's a Democratic Party president of the United States, it generally falls to something like 20% of people have negative views of the United States. When there's a Republican, it rises. Now it's through the roof. Now it's now we hear the most conservative, previously pro-Trump and pro-American politicians talking about U.S. imperialism. They're sounding like the person selling the socialist newspaper outside the subway station. And much like we heard Friedrich Merz in Germany using exactly that language. And we're now hearing other formerly conservative, formerly very pro-American leaders using it. It's caused a conversation about defense to shift onto a new level. Previously, Canada was very proud of its role in the NATO collective defense alliance, and got criticized by Donald Trump in his first term for not spending 2% of GDP on defense. It was a fairly significant participant in the Afghanistan war by the standards of NATO countries that aren't the United States, but generally defense is not such a big thing. Now suddenly the Trump goals of defense spending are out the window, and there is serious talk in government about bolstering Canada's defense. I would say not because of the possibility of a US invasion as such, but because of the loss of the United States from NATO. Um, and our coalition of partners in Europe and so on are all having to bolster defense to make up for the loss of the United States, not just in material support for Ukraine and for any other hypothetical people who get invaded, but simply to make up for that gap. That requires a degree of fiscal expenditure that is well beyond what Canadians have contemplated recently. So at the same time as the tariffs are going to be causing 2 quarters of downturn or more, and massive unemployment, we also have the premiers and probably whoever's the next prime minister in a few weeks pledging to provide economic supports to companies and workers who are jobless and so on. So we're going to have a big pandemic style fiscal expenditure on replacing the economic losses caused by this, at the same time as we will have serious obligations as a NATO member to replace that spending, which is levels of arms expenditure we've never seen. We were vaguely talking about buying submarines for the first time since the 90s. Now we may be buying very expensive submarines from somebody other than the United States for the first time. So the defense is tied into the fiscal realities in a big way as well. And it's a new mentality. There have always been constituencies of Canadians who have called for. Anyway, it also shapes the political outcome of Canada, which we may be getting to momentarily. I'll just say that a good indication of where Canada stood previous to this was it was the only country in the former British Empire where even extremely left-wing people were monarchists. There's a whole category of people, including a famous colleague of mine who I call monarchist-Leninists in Canada, because they're both extremely left-wing and they believe that the king should remain the head of state of Canada. And that's entirely because in the Canadian imagination, the idea of having an elected head of state is associated entirely with the United States and it's defensive monarchism. So you're going to see some weird politics coming out of Canada, and you're going to hear people breaking free from their usual ideological positions in this, including on national defense, where we see some very left-wing people who'd previously been very disfavorable toward big defense spending, except in peacekeeping, suddenly favoring big defense spending.
Thanks, Doug. I want to bring Eric into this topic for his thoughts, and also a question that we've gotten from the audience, and it's a question that gets debated back and forth in Canada, or it did previously, but it seems to be taken for gospel now that, let's just say it more seriously in Canada now, that this is not just a Trump negotiating tactic, that there actually is an intent behind this, or a will to try and see something like this happen in terms of the sovereignty question. Eric, is Canada just fallen into the trap of playing Trump's negotiating game and got themselves all in a lather to their detriment, or is there more substance behind these threats that Canadians know about that leads them to to react the way they're reacting now?
So Ken, if one says something 1 or 2 times, you can dismiss it as an oddity or a lark. But President Trump has talked about the annexation of Canada, while concurrently putting out insulting emails about the Prime Minister and other Canadian political leaders maybe 50 times now. And once you start talking that level of mentions, you have to take seriously the intention behind it. And so I think we don't know what this looks like. We don't know how people in the security establishment would react, depending on what it is that he were looking to do. But he was very transparent about his strategy of trying to put extreme pressure on Canada in hopes that it will wake up one day, cry uncle, and decide to join the United States. But what you've seen, and colleagues on the panel have described this, is a very significant reaction. And so you watch Mark Carney, the new leader of the Liberal Party, who replaced Justin Trudeau last evening, made very strong statements about how Canada will never be part of the US and plans to run his whole campaign on that particular theme. Likewise, the Conservative candidate, Pierre Poilievre, has also become much, much more pointed about his concerns about President Trump's intentions toward Canada. And so there is no divergence about where Canadians are. And the irony is that Donald Trump is forcing Canada to deal with perhaps some longstanding issues and problems. But, there is a sense that we don't know what the United States will do. This is also viewed in the same context as threats against Panama, as threats against Greenland, as statements around Gaza and what may happen there. And so what people are trying to figure out is, when Donald Trump says these things, what does this mean in terms of territorial intentions? Of course, where Canadians are very, very focused and very aware is on the shift in approach around Ukraine. And so there is a very strong sense that Canada needs to get closer to the European Union. At the same time, the European Union is moving to significantly ramp up defense. You have the government of France offering essentially to use its nuclear weapons to create a European security umbrella. And that is being used out of fears, not only of Russia, but also of the United States. And so the United States has long wanted allies to spend more on defense. And that is something that is going to happen, not because it's something that is seen as good policy, but because the view on NATO and the Article 5 mutual defense commitments is that that process is largely dead. The US cannot necessarily be relied upon to stand up with its allies to carry through on commitments that have been set forth. Nobody knows for sure what that looks like in the event of further Russian action in Europe or an attack on Taiwan, which is in a very, very different sort of scenario. But the sense is that every country is on their own. Canada very much feels that. And so it is doing its best in this interregnum between what has been said and what may eventually come in the future to try to bolster both its economy and its national defense.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Alex, I'll bring you in, and then I know Marta is going to lead us into segue into the next section. So comment on that, and also just to tie up this section, no one has yet, we haven't touched upon Trump's envy of Canadian minerals.
Yeah, well,
What the motivating factor, and also as a questionnaire has just pointed out, the keen interest that we know Russia, China also, but Russia has, and the United States in the Arctic, right? Which happens to be a very near and dear Canadian issue. So let's just bring in those two issues as or how you want to play them in terms of substance to what Trump wants and how we might, what tactics he might use to get it. And then Marta will lead us into the section on the effect on Canadian politics and where we go from there.
Sure. So to those two issues you just mentioned, I want to add a third, because I think this variable is important. It hasn't come up yet, and I believe it kind of ties this entire conversation together. And that is the legally mandated renegotiation of the Continental Trade Agreement. That has to happen starting next year. And there are some signs that the Trump folks would like to begin it sooner. And the reason I bring it up now is we've driven ourselves crazy trying to figure out Trump's motivation here. Does he want to annex Canada? Is he trying to negotiate? I believe he'd be perfectly willing to live with one of two scenarios, right? In scenario A, he puts on the brass knuckles and pounds Canada into economic submission. And basically we hand over our lunch money in the renegotiation of the US-Canada-Mexico agreement over the next few months. And he's got his list of asks. including dairy, autos. There are a bunch of different things he may ask for in those negotiations. So scenario A is Canada delivers some of the things that are longstanding U.S. asks and maybe some non-traditional American asks, including, I think, Doug had mentioned the goods and services tax, changing our tax structure. So that's scenario A. Scenario B, Canada does not give in to those requests easily, and finds itself economically impoverished, and suddenly it's ripe for the picking, and sees its only way out of pervasive long-term poverty as joining the United States. I think he would take either scenario, right, as a positive outcome. One thing he has encountered, and one of the reasons you'd want to have Canada as part of your country, is exactly what you just mentioned: this sort of vast resources, the prospect of shipping lanes opening up in the Arctic, minerals and mines to supply your military and your civilian industries. But one thing he hasn't counted on is this lesson that nationalists very often forget, is that nationalism begets nationalism, and that for every action he's taken, there's been a counter reaction in Canada where Canadians would probably, and if I'm reading the room correctly, I'm not there right now, would probably be willing to suffer a modicum of economic immiseration in order to, tell him to, back off. And so he's not getting the desired outcome. So, so it's we are seeing a more unstable world. This is the North American tranche of a global conversation. But somebody talked about Canada, Canadians starting to have a conversation about having nuclear weapons. I don't think that conversation's gone very far, but France is talking about expanding its nuclear umbrella. And I'm no expert in how the First World War began, but I'm starting to fear that we are living an experience, a breakdown of a global order that none of us has ever experienced in our lifetime. Only this time the globe has nuclear weapons, so there's something to be, to keep us all up at night. But that's, so anyhow, renegotiate Kuzma. If that fails, maybe an attempt to annex Canada, and in a much more unstable world.
Okay, Eric and Doug, just quick comments on this section before we move.
Yeah. I mean, minerals are something that President Trump has shown he's keenly interested in. It was central to the agreement that was to be signed with President Zelensky during his ill-fated visit to the White House. It's been central to the discussion about Greenland. Donald Trump, as one who takes a William McKinley view of the world, believes that control of natural resources are central to national power, and he views Canada as one of the largest stores of natural resources in the world, which could be enormously helpful to the U.S.
Doug.
I would be wary of ascribing a single narrative motive to Donald Trump's stated territorial desire for Canada or Greenland or Panama or even for Russian control of Ukraine, especially the idea that he has a pre-planned resource grab sort of idea on that. I mean, he does, Eric's quite correct that he does have some sort of narrative idea that these are countries with great riches that you can grab almost like a video game or something like that. It doesn't make any economic sense. I mean, it's worth pointing out that the United States has as much access to the resources, natural resources of Canada or Ukraine or any other place without controlling that territory as it would by seizing it, right? There's actually probably not that much rare earth mineral resources in Ukraine that could be exploited within a 10-year window. And US companies were the major companies operating in that part of Ukraine in 2014 during the Russian invasion and in 2022 during the second Russian invasion. The treaty is a smart move by Zelensky because he knows there's the theoretical reserves are a very different thing from exploitable minerals, and he's not really giving anything up. Similar would be true of Canada. Canada has some very limited limits on foreign ownership of resource companies, but the United States is, it's the major owner of much of the resource sector. And not only that, any economist within your country will tell you that owning the company that gets them is not the way to get resources most efficiently to your people. I think Venezuelans have learned that taking national control of an extractive industry is away from a diversity of extractors from various countries is not the way to enrich yourself in the greatest fashion. And also, there's no indication that Donald Trump really has that kind of a program in mind. The worry, I think, that we face is that he will combine sort of vague ideas about the desirability of countries and about softening up countries as a negotiating strategy with increasing anger and moments of unpredictability. So he has made it clear to Prime Minister Trudeau, I should say the New York Times article we're referring to, and earlier reporting as well by Alex and his colleagues, indicated that Trump had told Trudeau that he wanted to cancel the 1806 treaty that defines the Canada-US border, which is a pretty unambiguous way of saying we want to move that border, and you're not going to be doing that through a treaty. That's a forceful move. Of course, we say he's not going to do that, but we can imagine a scenario in a few months, the US economy is on the rocks because of months of on and off tariffs. Donald Trump is increasingly angry and erratic. He has fired all of the generals in the military who said no to him in his various requests during his first term and replaced them with political yes men and former Fox News correspondents and things like that. If in a moment of caprice, he were to get on the phone and say, let's have some little incursion into Southern Ontario to arrest a bunch of traitors that I've identified there who are maybe Canadian politicians or something, who down the command chain would say no, and how many days would it take before sanity were restored and he stopped that? And would that escalate into a crisis? So this is what we're talking about. We're not talking about a careful plan of imperial expansion of the sort that we saw in previous eras of the United States, or something like a Spanish-American War expanding into territorial seizure. We're talking about the risk of a very erratic man having nobody who will say no to him. And I think that's something that Canada does share with the rest of the Americas at this particular time, that suddenly we're in the same boat that some of you were generations ago.
Thanks so much, Doug. I'm cognizant of the time, so I'm going to try to sort of shorten our two last areas that we want to touch on. The first is obviously, as Ken already mentioned, our upcoming election. So if you could, I'm going to come to, I think, Alex, if you could answer this question in terms of the upcoming Canadian election. What's the impact that this is going to have? Some of you have already alluded to sort of Mark Carney's comments last night, what the positioning will be there. How has this also shifted political sort of standings in Canada? Polls have shifted greatly in the last month or so. So Alex, if you could answer that question, and we'll go from there.
Sure. I just want to quickly relate how my understanding of the conversation between Trudeau and Trump went down over that the boundary, the 1908 boundary treaty. So this was on February 4th. So what my understanding is what Trump told the Prime Minister was, Justin, have you seen this 1908 Canada-US boundary treaty? And then Trudeau's like, apparently my understanding is he kind of bluffed and it's like, yeah, okay, but yeah, and Trudeau and Trump says, Very interesting, Justin. Very interesting. And that's about as detailed as it got. But then Trudeau later said something to the effect of, well, it's invalidated now by the repatriation of our Constitution in 1982, which was a bluff as well. Because he didn't know the details. And that's how it went down. So it was not the most sophisticated conversation. Canadian politics. Yes, you're absolutely correct, Marta. Donald Trump has shown a near biblical ability to resurrect Lazarus from the dead, Lazarus being the Liberal Party of Canada. And so Trudeau's party was, I don't know, polling 20 points behind up until very recently. I believe two events happened. The first is Trudeau himself resigned. And, in Canada, we tend to tire of our prime ministers after about 9 years. It's kind of our history. We don't have term limits. They are imposed by the laws of political science. And so, Trudeau resigning was, I think, one of the reasons that the Liberal Party has experienced this resurgence in its fortunes. The second being this reaction to Trump. It benefits the Liberals for a variety of reasons. I'm sure my colleagues can talk about. But the second thing this does, I think, is it creates a bit of a political headache for the Conservative Party. And this is why you are very happy, if you are the Liberals, that the conversation has gone from being one about carbon taxes and economic productivity in Canada to the ballot box question being Canada's relationship with the United States. Not only because you think you're on the side of the angels on some of these issues, but because it divides the Conservative Party. Donald Trump is not popular in Canada, but he is popular with a tranche of Canadian Conservatives. I'd say, maybe he doesn't have a 50% approval rating among Conservatives in Canada, but close. And so by making this argument about him, by forcing Pierre Poilievre to talk about him, to repudiate him, to say, I don't agree with you, to fight back against Donald Trump, you risk getting a sort of this recoil against him on the right and seeing votes bleed away. Either people stay home, don't show up on election day, or maybe just vote for the farther right leaning party, the more populist party, Maxime Bernier's. And so that's the two effects that Donald Trump has had, consolidating, the left around the Liberals, and risks splitting the right. And that's kind of the political math of it.
Great. Doug or Eric, did you want to take a comment on the politics, please?
Yeah. So Justin Trudeau stepped down. Mark Carney, who's the former governor of the Bank of Canada and of the Bank of England, became the new leader. The real question that is going to decide the next election is, who do Canadians most trust to deal with Donald Trump? And so I think it is, even though we should expect an election call within a matter of days, with voting on either the 28th of April or the 5th of May, it's too early to say who will carry the day. Certainly, Mark Carney and the Liberals have had momentum, but they're still behind in the polls. And, there is a legacy of frustration that people have had with the governing Liberal Party. That said, as Alex has described, the Conservatives are in a complicated political situation. And so the strategists of both of the major parties are wargaming out messages that they want to try to put forward. But, had Donald Trump lost the election, Pierre Poilievre, I think, fairly clearly would have been cruising to a crushing majority government, leading in the polls by 25%. But people are afraid now. And when people are afraid, they look differently at their options. And so the task of both Mr. Poilievre and of Mr. Carney will be to convince voters that they are the ones who can deliver Canada through this very difficult period.
It's worth remembering that the reason why Canada is having an election now, rather than in October or thereabouts, when would be the normal time, is because the governing Liberal Party fell apart in good part over how to deal with Donald Trump. The resignation of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau took place when his finance minister resigned suddenly before announcing a budget, with a letter angrily complaining that his spending of money, of sending checks to Canadians essentially to buy votes, and so on, was fiscally irresponsible during a time when we should be keeping our powder dry and saving our fiscal resources to fight the incoming Trump administration. She also ran for liberal leader and lost quite badly, but nevertheless, it was this dissension over how to deal with Trump that caused the government to fall apart. And as both Alex and Eric have said, it's the only issue in this election, which is unique. In early January, I'd written that this would be the first election in maybe 30 or 40 years during which immigration would be a big issue, because there'd been a bunch of it and it was unpopular with some people for the first time in modern Canadian history. And the polls generally showed that Canadian voters were concerned with inflation, economic matters, immigration, things like that. All of those things are now gone, disappeared as election issues. Canada will be, and the parties sound strikingly similar to one another. Pierre Poilievre, who had spent his early term, he was an atypical conservative leader. There, I should note to those of you from outside the country, there is no political party in Canada of the ultra-nationalist populist right, of the Trump variety, that has even one seat in a national or provincial legislature. Alex alluded to a party further right than the Conservatives. Even their leader has never won a seat in Parliament and probably has no chance of doing so. The leader of the Conservative Party, Pierre Poilievre, while he doesn't come from a background of extreme right populism or nationalism, he spent the last couple of years, he was willing to indulge the subset of Canadians who are anti-vaccination people and that sort of thing with conspiracy theories of the Trump sort. You know, he would go on about the World Economic Forum running the world and all this other stuff. He has instantly shut up about that. He held a big rally on February 15th in which he said he was the best to fight Trump's tariffs and Trump's sovereignty threats. It may be too late for him, but it might not be. The nightmare is for Canada, and for a lot of you observing Canada, is that because of the way our parliamentary system works, we really need to have a government that is elected with strong support from Canadians. There's a real possibility that we'll come out of the election in a few weeks with the Conservative Party not having a majority of votes, but having more votes than the Liberals. But the Liberals plus the Social Democratic NDP party, who currently co-govern effectively in Parliament, together having more votes than the Conservatives. In the Canadian system, that means that after the election, the current government continues to govern, unless one of its members decides to pull the plug on it. That would be extremely unpopular with Canadians across the political spectrum, and it would put us in a weak position because Trump would be able to question the legitimacy of the elected government of Canada. So it's going to be a shaky election, both because of the threats Canada faces and the stakes of it, but also because of the possibility that it'll produce an ambiguous outcome that could put Canada on a further weak footing.
Thanks, Doug. I'm going to ask one last question to each of you and then give it over to Ken to finish us off. But if you can give us sort of a short synopsis, what would you suggest people look for to indicate where this relationship is going? Like what's happening between Canada and the US? And what would you sort of let people know, like what you can look for, what sort of inflection points might there be, and what you should be watching out for? Eric, can we start with you and then over to...
Sure. So I think what observers of Canada want to look for are special tariffs that may be brought into effect. So are there special tariffs on particular products? Is there a separate category of tariffs, the 25% tariffs that were promised in November, first imposed and then frozen in February, imposed and frozen in March? But do they get added to this reciprocal tariff? The other thing that you want to look for is the question of whether the United States and Canada either dissolve certain international agreements, institutional partnerships, things of that nature, or whether the US begins to actively advocate for Canada to be removed. And so, for example, the intelligence sharing partnership among the US, UK, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. There's been some discussion of removing Canada. And so diminished institutionalization and specific tariffs, I think, are where you want to look.
Thanks, Alex.
Yeah, I think we're fortunate that we'll have an opportunity to take in two milestone moments over the next 48 hours, probably. That'll allow us to sort of see whether there's a possible shift, and whether Trump might be reconsidering some of the stuff he's done. So Canada just got a new prime minister designate, I guess. The Liberal Party has chosen Mark Carney. I keep checking my phone because the White House hasn't reacted yet, and I've been asking for a reaction today. Trump hasn't said a word yet. There was no White House press briefing today. And I'm wondering whether the administration uses this moment as a potential off ramp from its ever escalating tension with Canada, to say, look, we'll talk to this guy. We'll see whether he's smarter than Trudeau. I mean, he might obviously try and save face with some sort of comment, but I'm just wondering whether he uses, the arrival of a new prime minister to turn down the temperature in some way. But the second event to watch this week is the arrival of steel and aluminum tariffs in 2 days, and I think Eric was talking about some grades of steel that the United States does not produce domestically, so that's going to be a bit messy. But in particular on aluminum, the United States is heavily reliant on Canadian aluminum, in part because Quebec benefits from such cheap hydroelectricity in an industry that was built to supply American warplanes in the Second World War. The United States has always been a heavy customer for Canadian aluminum, and I don't know whether they proceed with tariffs that will do nothing but drive up the cost of a number of goods in the United States. That's two things to watch. What do they say about the new prime minister, and what do they do in particular with aluminum tariffs? Do they see this as an opportunity to adjust?
Alex, I'm a little disappointed because I thought when you're talking about major events this week, you were going to mention my birthday. But okay, I
For your birthday, you get tariffs.
I can deal with this flight. Go ahead, Doug.
You don't want tariffs for your birthday, trust me. And in fact,
well,
give you a tariff rate quota, kid.
I'm not going to be drinking Jack Daniels. Whatever.
No. We published a list of Canadian-made bourbons that consumers can buy instead. And by the way, this is for those of you outside of Canada. It's wild the extent to which Canadians have removed American products from their shopping lists. Every supermarket has great big signs on anything that's from the United States, or they've just removed it from their shelves. I got a long research note from a friend on how to buy cat food that's not made in the United States, and so on. Anyway, I mean, on that note, Canada's kind of the bellwether country to watch in the Americas on how to fill the USA-sized hole in the world's economy and international affairs. The United States has gone protectionist economically to a much greater degree than it ever has been before during our lifetimes, and it's gone isolationist in affairs such as defense. To an extent that could never have been imagined before. Canada will be tempted to respond by escalating the trade war with permanent countervailing tariffs. I would hope that that is not the lasting response, despite the political temptation, not just because we've made it very clear to the United States, and I think former Prime Minister Trudeau did actually a good job of this in making it clear that protectionism and tariffs are not what we want, that they are a way of victimizing your own population and your own consumers. And that we are all trading nations and we all benefit from these relations. But we need to recognize that Canadian countervailing tariffs would shoot Canadian consumers in the foot and would further impoverish us in a similar way. The sort of measures that Eric talked about that are pinpoint targeted to send the message to the United States are much better. But also, Canada needs to very quickly start diversifying, and I don't mean to replace the United States fully. As I mentioned earlier, we'll never do that, but it needs to start building links with other countries that view trade as important, that view climate relations as important, that view defense relations as important, not because we're necessarily going to replace the United States, but because as a matter of principle, we want to maintain a world of open trade, open borders, open international relations for such a moment as the United States returns to sanity.
We will end it there. Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Eric. A video of this will be available on our website, ccacanada.com, hopefully by tomorrow. Again, thank you for staying with us. We've got very little drop off, even though we've gone beyond our time. Y gracias a todos nuestros que están con nosotros, que son hispanoparlantes. Thank you all again for being with us tonight. Have a good rest of your evening. Thank you.